I don't have a lot for this morning. Something came up as a result of Sunday's sermon, and so I'm going to start with that, and then you guys can take the conversation wherever we want to go. But what happened after the sermon went up, and sometimes this happens because people share it with people who are like-minded. So, but there was a massive pylon yesterday of what shall I call them? Objectors to the sermon. In fact, the vitriol was quite significant, especially on the blog. And now the blog, I get to see the comments before I approve them. And the way in which I do this is I try to create a safe space on the blog. If no matter how objectionable, if someone asks a question, I approve it, right? So if they ask, even if it's an objectionable thing, like I will still, but if they're just, you know, commenting to tell me that I'm a wicked person leading the flock astray without a question, they can say that. I don't have a problem with people saying that kind of stuff. But if they don't have a question, I don't see the point in putting it up there. So there were a lot of those kinds of comments without questions. The one that went on YouTube attracted a lot of people to the blog, and I think that's what happened. But it was a big, huge pylon. And
First of all, Don, you kept talking about pylon, and I got this big orange cone.
Where I come from in Belfast, a pylon is where it includes fists.
I figured that out.
Yeah. And these were verbal, well, they weren't verbal, but
ganging up on you.
They were ganging up in words. And the main objection, there was a thread running through them. The main objection was the more than literal meaning of the scripture. And so I don't want to get into an argument about biblical literalism or a conversation about that necessarily, but what it evoked in me was, oh my goodness, how do you talk to these people? How do you talk to people? How do you respond to the negativity? And for me, more important, how do you respond to people? I'm doing a funeral tomorrow for people who have left the church. And the church that they have left is the church I left a long time ago. And so how do we and have conversation about that with people who are not, just interested in changing your mind, but who just say, I'm done. How do you have those kinds of conversations, and what is of value to us taking forward? I happen to think that the more than literal meaning of things, and that's not my turn of phrase, that's Marcus Borg, the more than literal meaning of a story is crucial in all kinds of things. And people have no problem in the Marvel universe dealing with the more than literal. I mean, it's like superheroes are superheroes, right? And yet we have this desire in what Borg calls the common Christianity of recent history to prove that something is literally and historically true. And the more than literal meaning is not important. Anyone want to jump off from there?
I have a very conservative evangelical friend. I use that term a bit lightly, but who I have discussions with. And I have to tell you, when I listen to him, what I'm hearing is, if one piece of it falls, it all falls. And that seems to be almost the defensiveness drives from that. And that is, it had to be exactly the way it was. Otherwise, there are other pieces you're going to be able to pick apart. And therefore, I won't give any ground on that. And I believe that's, for me, that's what I hear from most of my, and I have a lot of them because I did prison ministry with a pretty much evangelical group for 20 years and bit my tongue and all that. But I believe that's where it comes from.
Yeah. So picking up on the fear of it all falling apart, the piece they built their lives around all falling apart. I heard that in the, we shouldn't ordain women argument, and then I heard it in the inclusion of full inclusion of the LGBT community, and it was like if we cross that line, it's a slippery slope. Um, and the next thing you know, they'll be saying that Jesus, the story of Jesus, is a metaphor. And the truth is, they're absolutely right. It is a slippery slope, and it does lead to a new way of understanding things. But therein lies the blessing, I think. Um,
How many of
and
us have been there, like where we thought that you couldn't
Oh, me.
risk? Yeah, like
Right here.
way back, and it was like just too frightening to, because you knew that everything you had needed this part to stay in place and this part, not realizing that it was such a more durable story that we were embracing, that it was much bigger than we imagined, and able to handle so much, and respecting each person's journey in the midst, that we didn't all have to believe exactly the same thing for it to be safe to fellowship. um, and uh, and it was always the young ones coming in who were where we used to be, and then, okay, yeah, I'm familiar with that. I don't need to destroy you, but I would give some hint that say, yeah, that used to be exactly where I was, and I found that there's some riches that surprised me, and leave it at that, and hopefully entice them a bit to say, well, what are those?
yeah, it is sometimes difficult to resist the temptation to swat them. You know what I mean? Not physically, but like intellectually. Like one of the comments was the truth is the Bible was written literally. So clearly the person does not understand the meaning of the word literal. So the temptation to just intellectually swat them away and put them down by saying, well, you clearly don't understand what literal means, um, or that um, for generations people have understood that this is the literal historical truth. Well, that's not true either. None of that's true. How do you begin a conversation with them? I mean, Mike, you talked about what you hear, like it's the listening piece. So what's the fear here? And when the fear is that the whole house of cards will come tumbling down, um, identifying with that, I think is maybe, like Andrew says, the place to start. Like I was there too. I was there. I used to believe that, that you had to believe in the physical resuscitation of a corpse. That's where I was. And then, the story was opened up for me in various different ways. And I think sometimes appealing to something beyond the scriptures. Like I remember in grade 9, we had it was the first opportunity. So grade 9, how old are you in grade 9? You're like 16 or something?
14, 15.
14, 15 in grade 9. Okay. So it was the first opportunity where I could take a course called poetry. And I didn't know what poetry was, but I knew I liked English. So I thought, okay, English lit courses, right? So I'll take this poetry course. But my understanding of what poetry was completely different. I thought, you're at that age, it's like, well, poetry is a rhyme. It might be a song lyric, but I didn't really know what poetry was. And I remember being sent home with this Alfred Lord Tennyson's Intimations of Immortality, and reading it and going, I have no idea what this means. I don't like this. How do I withdraw from this course? This is nonsense. It's just gobbledygook, words strung together. I don't want to do this. And so it's a long poem. I read the poem, And within 5 minutes of the class the next day, I was amazed at what was teased out of just the first stanza, just what was teased out by the teacher, and all the riches of all these words in there. And it was like, oh. But when I went to the church, which is round about the same time, there was none of that teasing out from the scriptures that was happening. And I didn't make the connection that that could be done until much later. And I think that if you can talk about a story that somebody loves, or a movie that somebody loves, and pull out why they love it, and tease that kind of stuff out, and then say, well, can we do that with this story? There may, I've had some success with that, but it is, you know, it is a way in sometimes. Anybody else? Or do you just not talk to people who are like that? Like, I mean, it's not an option in my job, so that's a serious question.
I have a friend who is very evangelical and literal, and we really just don't talk about it because, I mean, she prays for me every day because I'm sure that she thinks I've, lost the way. And I think she and her husband and family have built their whole life around Christianity as they understand it. And, it just would be too earth-shattering for them to contemplate there's anything different. They feel they're so right, they're so correct in what they're doing, and the defenses are just too high to even acknowledge, even go there. I mean, I'm not going to change what she's thinking. She's not going to change what I'm thinking. So we meet twice a year, and
That's enough.
and I procrastinate on meeting, to be honest, because
It's not fun.
just, no, it isn't. There's no connection really, except our kids were in school together, right? But God took her child to Hong Kong, and that's the right place for him, and God does this, that, and the other for the family, and it's all falls into place very beautifully when you think that way.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, so you can cope with that twice a year. When that person is in your family, or what about the situations like, I have funerals on my brain because I'm doing one tomorrow. But one of the things that happens is people who would never dream of crossing the threshold of a church. Grandma dies, and grandma was a Lutheran, so we have to have a Lutheran funeral. And so they call the nearest Lutheran church and say, we need a Lutheran funeral. And you go, okay, I don't really do Lutheran funerals, but what is it you're looking for? And my goal usually is just to get them beyond the 23rd Psalm. And what's the other one? I failed miserably tomorrow because it's the 23rd Psalm, and we're singing. They're singing the old Rugged Cross and Amazing Grace. It's like, please, if I hear Amazing Grace one more time. But then I think about it and I think, well, that's all we've offered people. That's what we've offered, is this rote formula. And people are talking about, oh, she's gone to a better place. And you're like, really? Like, that's not Christian theology. It's like, wait a
But
minute.
it may be true.
It may be true. It may be true, but it's like what's expected is you're expected to go in there and affirm all of those notions that, God needed an angel. And it's like, oh, please, if I hear that again, and so it's like, even when I'm just attending a funeral, not having anything to do with the planning of it or the executing of it, all that stuff is reinforced. even when sometimes when it's not a church funeral, when lay people are doing it, and funeral home directors are the same, they have the same, it must be like programmed into them. And it's like, it's so refreshing when it's someone who had no connection to the church, has no desire to do that, and the funeral is just an open acknowledgement of death and absence and coping and celebrating and mourning and all of those kinds of things. And that I find missing in a lot of these. We need a Lutheran funeral, or we need a Roman Catholic funeral, or we need this. It's like, oh, they would have wanted that because they used to go to church, so you better say the Lord's Prayer. It's like, wait a minute, slow down. So how do you cope? Because I mean, seeing people once a year is, or once or twice a year is one thing, but dealing with these passages, Mike.
I was actually a bit facetious when I said it might very well be when you talked about they're in a better place. But sometimes when I see the world I live in, I think in a poetic way, I would rather be stardust than
Hmm.
continue to live in a world that where the cruelty, the the inequity, and all of that it continues to increase. It does not. It doesn't seem to be getting better. So when someone says move going to a better place, it's I'd rather be stardust
Yeah.
than continue to do that. I'm and for me, it's one of the questions I'm learning to ask is when people start wanting to get into a discussion of scripture is to ask, well, what difference does it make whether or not it is metaphorical or whether it is literal? What is the difference between that story for Sunday being a story, a metaphorical story, versus being a literal story? Is what Jesus stood for or stands for, whether you take him as the literal Jesus or as a metaphorical Jesus, what he stood for, what things he was about are still the same. And they're the things is, and that Marcus Borg had a comment and is if your faith system is not transformational, then what good is it?
Yeah. Yeah, and the problem with the literal Jesus is the pieces of Jesus that they don't want to take literally, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So I'm a literalist up until the point where I have to, care for the immigrant. Oh no, I don't want to do that.
Don't do that.
I'm a literalist. Okay, are you giving all your money away? No, I'm not going to do that. I'm a literalist. Are you going to love your neighbor? No, he's a son of a sea cook, kind of thing. It's literalism to a point. And it's almost like, okay, uh, the comment that I often get is you're just picking and choosing and cutting and pasting and creating your own Bible. And my response to that, generally speaking, is yes, that's what I'm doing. That's what the church has done
Yeah, forever.
always. Not only that, that Jesus fellow, he did it with his sacred scriptures, right? He picks out the pieces of Isaiah and Daniel that are pertinent for the situation, and those are the ones that he applies. Um, it's like, okay, I mean, the church even calls it a pericope, which in Latin means to cut out. So you cut out a piece of scripture and you think of that today. So there's no ifs, ands, or buts. We create the scriptures that resonate with us and with our lives. It's always been that way. Um, and when anyone says, well, who gave you permission to do that, my response, generally speaking, is that fella Jesus. If you just look at his life, he's cutting and he's pasting, he's creating from his own sacred scriptures, um, a new way of being in the world. And that's the task of every generation, of everyone who wants to be in relationship with the mystery. I mean, you have to you have to that's what life is about, right? Is finding out what life is about. I mean, the ancient Greeks had it right.
Mhm.
Know thyself. Know thyself. Um, and I think that one of the things that living in a corporate system where the whole system is geared at alienating us from ourselves and from creation, it's a hard sell these days to encourage people to give their head a shake, as my folks would say. Just give your head a shake, and struggle with it. I mean, my favorite biblical character from the Hebrew scriptures remains Jacob wrestling with that angel. That's what each one of us has to do. Tell me your name. Who are you? You know, what is this mystery? And in that is where the wisdom lies, I think. Well, that's a bit of a tangent from having open conversations, but I'm really curious about this because partly because um, the the nature of my job, when it puts me in contact with people outside of the church, it's generally because they don't have anything to offer in the face of death, and they want to rely on wisdom that has gone before. They don't know what to ask for, and they're ritually impoverished. And so we all end up going to all these funerals where the 23rd Psalm and Amazing Grace are served up as if it's the only thing on the menu.
So what do you do? What do you do in a
I
case like
usually
that?
try to open them up. My training in ritual studies was with a Mennonite who renounced his call to the ministry and went and studied indigenous ritual in New Mexico, and ended up laying the groundwork for the academic study of ritual in the academy, and wrote the definitive textbook that we all studied in ritual studies. And his question is always, when you're planning a ritual, the question is, what needs doing? And that's where I start with people. What needs to happen in this situation? And generally people want to pay honor to the life, and it's like, okay, what needs to happen in order for you to feel at the end of this that you honored so and so, that you there's usually that word honor comes up, and celebrate. And I'm usually the one, and this is my pastoral role, I'm usually the one that says, are we also going to shed a tear? Because people are worth crying over. And so how are we going to mourn? And with those questions in mind, people are pretty good at at finding that. Sometimes they don't have the words, um, or they'll have a thought, and I will suggest certain things. But yeah, they can put it together. Sometimes if the family is particularly dysfunctional, we'll end up like tomorrow, we'll end up with the 23rd Psalm. Um, but I always get to pick the gospel, so I can play with that myself. And sometimes there's nothing from the Bible. Sometimes it's poetry, sometimes it's a piece of music. Um, but yeah, and I always start with my the I always start with the cosmos. It's my preamble when we get there. I start with the cosmos and I end with the mystery. And my favorite piece of scripture is actually part of the Lutheran committal service. It's Paul saying, "Lo, I tell you a mystery. We will all be changed in the twinkling of an eye." And it plays into this notion of, I don't know, you know, which is an answer. It may not be the
Hmm.
answer we want, but it's mystery. And then you get those funerals that you're invited to craft, where the person, uh, Carol's not here, so I probably shouldn't say this, but in her office, there's a file. Here's what I want for my funeral, because they have one last message to give to the people that they care about, and that happens more often these days, and mostly because people don't want certain things to happen. Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
working
Don't
on that now.
You're working on your file, and yeah, yeah. I haven't updated mine for years. I It's like, no, I'm not going there. Well, and the only reason I would have one, and that goes away in a month, is when we die, the clergy die, um, synod office comes in and organizes the funeral. And so most of us are like, oh crap, I don't want that funeral. And so that's the only reason I had a file. But yeah, that won't happen now. Yeah, it's funny things that hierarchy imposes. It's weird. It's weird.
It's
Sharon.
funny. It's funny what people want. Um, a very, very good friend of mine, I've known her for over 50 years, died a few years ago. And another friend and I got together, and we knew she did not want the Catholic funeral mass. So we had it at the funeral home. And Kathy and I put it together. And we took a song, My Soul. I can't think of the author's name right now. You know him, I just won't come to me. We put pictures to the song. We used poetry from Mary Oliver.
Mm.
Uh, yeah. And we just did put it together. We even had cartoons of Winnie the Pooh about what is friendship and things like that throughout. At any rate, had a good priest friend of ours come and just talk a few minutes and invite others to talk. And then, of course, because I knew her the best, I had to give a little talk about her, and we did that. At the end, we used Anne Murray and the group from the miners from the Nova Scotia. We Will Rise Again.
Mm-hmm.
That song is the
Mm-hmm.
that. When I got out in the hall, people came up to Kath and me, and they just said, "That was the best funeral we've ever been at. Will you do ours?"
There you go.
It was so joyful. We miss her so much, but it was the way she would want to go out.
Mm-hmm.
The people from the funeral home had kept putting their heads in the door just to say, they said, we have never seen anything like that. So it made me feel good to know that, we did something different, and that it would be meaningful to her, which was good. But I wanted to go back, like that was just one story. I wanted to go back to the idea of fear. And I don't know if it's just a Catholic thing, but the fear of going to hell is huge.
It's not just a Catholic thing. It's a cultural thing.
Yeah.
It's
So
a
if you question, you were never to question, you were never to doubt. It was the way it was, you accept that. And so that whole idea, if I give this up, if those cards start to fall, and they sure do, it's a domino effect. Like I can remember how quickly it went down. For me, it just boom, boom, boom. And so getting rid of that feeling of, boy, God's going to be mad at me. And I remember doing a retreat, and one of the women came up to me and she said, "You never once mentioned the Pope's encyclical on whatever it was." I said, "No, I didn't." "Aren't you afraid of dying? Aren't you afraid of meeting God?" No, no, God's going to say, Sharon, thank you for using your brain and thinking differently. You were dead wrong, but that's okay. You used your brain. I don't know, but that fear is there, and it's so prevalent even today when I talk to people.
Yeah. And I think that cultural thing is there if you watch any kind of movie, television show, it'll run through that. It's that this is what Christians teach and believe, is that you have to, you know, do thus and so in order to get in. And if you don't do thus and so, you will go to a terrible place. It's a bargain. They've reduced it to a commercial transaction.
Or
And
card game. And
yeah, card game is there.
the Trump. Oh no.
Yeah,
No.
yeah, yeah. And so we're often called in to provide the insurance just in case. Like, um, I remember being called to a hospital in an emergency. It doesn't happen so much now. It used to happen a lot about 10 years ago, where a child would be stillborn and you would get called in on an emergency to baptize that baby. One of the first things they teach us in seminary is we don't baptize dead babies. That's just not, we just don't do that. But that's the only rite that people know about in order to mark the presence of this child. I always did whatever was necessary in the moment. Um, but the thing is, when you refuse to give the insurance lines, like, um, so when people, I it would be so easy to lean in metaphorically and talk about imagining, you know, the big thing for most people is they want to be recognized when they die by whatever they meet. And I think that's a human survival thing that's innate in all of us. And I struggle with that because metaphorically it's lovely to do that. Um, but all I can actually say is I don't know. um, However, my experience of the mystery so far is that the mystery is love. So whatever it is, it'll be okay.
That's exactly right.
You know, so I have no fear of it. Um, and isn't that what faith is, right? To trust the mystery enough to fall into the mystery and trust that you will be held. That's enough for me. That's not what we have in instilled in people
Yeah.
in terms of being enough. And so, you know, if it's blackness, that blackness is okay, right? If it's nothingness, that nothingness will be okay. And what stardust is transformed into, that's okay as well. And that my presence is in whatever love that I have managed to be part of here and now in this place. And that's enough. But there's this desire for, you know, most people's can like visions of whatever heaven is or the afterlife is sounds like pure hell to me, you know. It's like, what is it Billy Joel says? I'd rather laugh with the sinners than cry with the saints. Like, I am not going to heaven. If heaven's what people's vision of it is, don't sign me up. I don't want to go. But the mystery intrigues me and it allures me, and that that's what I read in the writings of the mystics, and that allures me and that intrigues me. um but when people are in the midst of grief, they want to hang their hat on, I will see them again. And that's understandable. I'm getting some strange voices here. from the other side. Mike, they're warning you.
What just occurred to me was several months ago, I was reading, I'm quite a fan of Barbara Brown Taylor's preaching. I just love to hear her preach. But she was asked in a presentation, after a presentation, some questions about this whole notion of God and heaven and all that. And basically her comment was a very short one. She said, I really just can't talk much more about theology and who God is and what God is. And I just can't do that coherently without making some people angry. So she said, about the only thing I can really say about my faith is that I trust that whatever comes to me is for me, period. And when you take that, I trust that whatever comes to me is for me, and just pull that apart and think about what the implications of that are, it seems to me that's a pretty good theological way to express how you see God. And that is, and I think I've kind of adopted that as my way of saying, whatever it is, God is love, whatever it is, I'll be okay with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I also think there's a need for some authenticity too, because I think one of the critiques of this way of being is that, well, it's not real, it's not authentic, it's all pie in the
No.
sky stuff and mystery and love and joy and all that kind of stuff. Like, to get on a really uh, the kind of authenticity, I remember years ago, there was the dean of the seminary that was in Minneapolis, the Lutheran seminary there, changed names, I always forget the new name. Anyway, Dan Simonson was part of the community that I lived in for a while in Point Robertson, Washington. And because he was the dean of the seminary and his area of teaching was Hebrew scriptures, the job of burying his uncle Logie fell on him. So he flew back from Minneapolis to bury his uncle Logie. And the church was full. People were standing on the steps outside. It's an old little white country church at the time. They've expanded it since. And it was full. And there was a level of expectation that you would not believe. And it had nothing to do with the guy who was in the coffin, because he was a son of a bitch. He was a horrible, nasty, vicious, terrible man. The reason we were all there is that Dan Simonson, he was one of the best preachers we'd ever, like, he used to come and preach there in the summertime. And I mean, he was a seminary professor, so you got good sermons. And he was a great storyteller. And we were all going to see how Dan was going to dress up Logie for heaven, right? Because he was an awful man. He should have been incarcerated several times in his life for the evil things that he did. Um, and Dan stood up, and I don't remember much of the sermon, but I do remember the first line, and it was a lesson in authenticity. Dan stood up and said, "Uncle Logie is gone. Creation will never be the same again." And it was an authentic line. We were all so glad he was gone. It was just, thank goodness he's gone. He's been making so many people's lives a misery. It's so good that he's gone. And he never left that. I mean, he didn't stand up and say he was a horrible, nasty, vicious man, but he preached an authentic piece that was more mourning the life that wasn't lived, the life that rejected the goodness in life and that kind of thing. So I think that one of the things that happens is when we move to a more mystical place in our lives, there's sometimes we ignore the tough stuff. Like, it's easy for me to say, I have no fear of it. When I die, I will fall into the embrace of whatever that is. if I don't also acknowledge that there is really some fear there, some trepidation, some, oh my goodness, what if I'm wrong? Like if you can't touch that authentic piece of your humanity, um, I think there's a problem. And so we have to find ways to include our fear in this. And I think part of the old model taught us that if we have faith, we have no fear. And I think exactly the opposite is true. I think if we have faith, we have the ability to to live with fear. It doesn't mean the
Rather than
fear.
having it a thought that you don't dare approach,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
you can't be sure how it'll end up.
yeah,
You can actually look it in the face and wrestle with it.
yeah.
I remember somebody I encountered when they were talking about this stuff, and I said, well, um, for me, I look at creation. Um, it's pretty impressive. What would you do? How would you improve it? Everything that you've seen that has evolved. Well, like the more we know, the more humbled we are.
Hmm.
And so if it is so undeniably, mind-blowingly complex and exquisite and terrifying at the same time, and we're part of that, that includes us then, and we also are that. And this person who's died, and their life was part of this story, and they've changed their bit of the universe in living, because everything matters in science. Science doesn't exclude any force or anything, actually. And so everything is eternal and it's part of the one story.
Hmm.
And so they, and most people acknowledge that they've been changed permanently by whoever that person was. Maybe not a big way, but everything has eternal impact. And we're the sum of all these impacts through our life, whether it be from nature or from other people, or from reading. And it's all magnificent. And some are feel more tragic because life's cut short or particularly painful, but they too impacted this universe. Um, and they are deeply missed, but they continue to impact it in the grief. Like they continue, that is a testimony to how knit together it really is. So that's,
Yeah. And I think it makes life all the more precious because if we recognize that what we do here is of importance, then we need to do important things. And that's for me always the call to move through this life and contribute in some way, uh, to offer your embodiment of the mystery here in this place, and that that implies that I can't ignore the suffering in the world, that I have to be part of alleviating that, that I can't ignore the systems that that don't honor and cherish life. Um, and so I have to resist those systems, and all of that is increased. Like if the whole sort of Christian deal is we're all going on to a better place and a better life, then why worry about what's going on here, right? But if this is this gift of life is so precious that you don't want to waste it, and you do have important things to offer, and it is all part of the whole, and so it does matter. I think it makes it more precious, and it also makes it more of an imperative to do important things, to make the contributions that are necessary for everyone to enjoy this precious gift of life. Wow. That's not where I thought we were going this morning. There we go. This is lovely. Thank you for this. Um, I wonder sometimes if part of this is hard to articulate, the whatever the mystery is, I have this notion that the essence of it is moves and interacts through this process of what some mystics call allurement, right? So we're not coerced into union with this mystery. We are intrigued and allured into it. And I often wonder if the kind of religious systems that we create, um, at their heart is this desire to allure into it. And somewhere along the way, Christianity lost its way. And instead of allurement, we went for coercion. We went for okay, I know how to get them in here. Let's make them afraid. Let's make them very, very afraid. And then you see how that works. Mike, you mentioned televangelists. They can make you. They know how to make you afraid, right? They know how to play to the fears. What would it look like if we play if we alignment and allurement were the ways in which we did this? Eh, I mean, I think creation, if you look at creation as part, there is a sense of allurement there, right? I mean, a flower doesn't just grow up to be a flower. It's like, hey, look at me, I'm pretty. It's like I'm bringing you in. I mean, springtime. How you really have to work hard to resist going outside. It's like we're just being invited into this creation, and for me, how do we project this notion of death as transition, as a further allurement into this union with mystery, um, and moving away from this notion of death as something to be feared, um, because of this threat of
Yeah.
of an angry God. I see Steve and Jane are both trying to get in. Go for it, Steve.
It's a difference between allurement and appeasement, and that's basically what we're into. And it's kind of magical versus mystical, and so it's that perspective. And I think we can allure people a lot more by not getting so tied to the Bible and getting more tied to the mystics of all else, if you will. So, and the Bible turns a lot of people off. You open the Bible or you say, okay, we've got to, in our service, we're going to talk about something from the Bible. And people say the Bible's not doing anything. So we have to go with a message that's consistent with the parable of Jesus, or and use whatever we've got available.
Yeah, I mean, the Apostle Paul would say, by any means possible, right? Allure people by any means possible. I once heard a theologian talk about the fact that if giving everybody a swimming pool in their backyard would allure them into, a good for all of creation, then let's get swimming pools in everyone's backyard, right? Any means possible. I'm not so sure that I'm ready to give up the wisdom of the ages. And I think that rather than rejecting the Bible, I just like to put the Bible in its place, which is a receptacle, a container, a sort of preserver of the wisdom of the ages. The poem I talked about Tennyson, great poetry, great literature, great music, great art. And I think that has intrinsic value for me. And I think there's something to be said for the stuff we choose to pass down. Think of all the movies you saw in the 1960s, right? All the movies you saw in the 1960s. Most of them you can't remember. There may be 3 or 4 of them that you remember. And those are the ones we'll pass down, right? Those are the ones we'll pass down to the next generation. Well, why do you remember them and why do you pass them down? Because they gave you something that made life better, that opened you to something, opened you to some aspect. Well, it's the same with poetry. It's same with scripture. It's same with the Gitas, the Bhagavad Gita. There are pieces in there that I would just toss aside and never look at again. But there's wisdom in there that's amazing. The Quran is the same way. Poetry, there's so much awful poetry that I never want to see again, never want to visit it. But there are pieces of it. The Bible is exactly the same. I mean, Luther wanted to rip out Revelation. I'd go along with that. Rip it out, burn it, never look at it again. And then someone will show me this piece of beauty in Revelation, and I'm like, There's a Lutheran theologian, a modern Lutheran theologian, who uses Revelation to open people up to environmental concerns. Well, she's found a way to do that, right? So there's something to be said for the stuff that we have been gifted from previous generations, the wisdom of the ages. I mean, the church calls it the communion of saints, but we just have to expand that, and not just focus on the Bible, but put the Bible in its place as a source of wisdom, in the same way that all great art is a source of wisdom.
Right.
So I think Jane is next, and then over to Mike again.
Going back to your point about coercion, and this thought came after your Maundy Thursday sermon. The church chose to go and make disciples of all nations, instead of love one another as I've loved you. So make, or is all like it's coercion, it rather than coming alongside and alluring with love and loving people into the mystery. We've gone and bashed them overhead. You've got to believe this or you go to hell.
Yeah.
So the church there again chose the wrong.
Well, they didn't choose it, they created it, because most New
Yes.
Testament scholars say Jesus never said go
Yes.
baptize.
Right. Right.
So
Yeah.
that was created by the community much later on.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mike, and then
I think
Sharon.
I think Borg, Crossan, Spong, that I think one of the greatest services they have done to scripture is by saying that until you understand first century Israel and you understand linguistics in the way words are used and created, and the way I think the way you dealt with the scripture piece on this Sunday, and that is to talk about it in terms of the context in which it was and what it would be seen like, how it would be heard, what would people hear. I think that's the part for me that makes scripture still very relevant to us, but we have to understand it. If you take it as Borg, Crossan, Spong, and the Jesus Seminar, as they spoke of scripture, I think it makes it much more meaningful than a lot of people believe. So I don't want to toss it away. But I want to say I'd rather deal with what it tells me when I understand what was being said.
Yeah, and part of that conversation is that we seem to believe that we live in unique circumstances. And this human endeavor, this human interaction with creation and with other humans has been going on since the beginning. And so there's something to be learned from the way previous generations, if they've wrestled with their angels and come up with this piece of wisdom, then then I want to look at it. I want to learn from it. I don't just want to learn from my contemporaries. And because that's an impoverished diet, so if you see humanity as evolving, and you want to have some notion about moving it slightly in its evolution, and I'm not just talking about its biological evolution. I mean, I'm talking about our psychological evolution as well. I mean, if you want to have some I want to find those folks who moved us to a better place, and see what wisdom I can glean from them, so we can move the future into a better place. And that's maybe a bridge too far for some people. I don't know, but I do think that, I mean, that old Tennyson poem was worth nothing until I found out about Tennyson's life, and the war and the colossal losses that he went through. And so all of a sudden that poem opened up and reduced me to tears. And there was a wisdom in that about the cost of violence that's worth handing down to the next generation. I've lost track of who's next. Was that you, Sharon? I think.
It was Jane, I think, but then
Oh,
she's gone. So
I,
Sharon.
Um, I think there's a place too in allurement for comforting.
Mhm.
I go back to a course I was teaching on sacraments, and a teacher came up after one class and she said, 30 years ago, my parents had a stillborn child, and because that child could not be baptized, could not be buried in sanctified ground, as if all ground isn't sanctified. Um, she knew that. And she said her parents could never get over it, that her mother still cried after 30 years, fearing that she would never see the child. It was all those things. And so it took me
yeah,
a, it took me a while, but I found a priest finally, took the parents to the place where the child was buried, and poured holy water and blessed the ground.
mhm,
And the young teacher came afterwards and said, "You can't imagine the change in my parents."
yeah.
And so I think that if they're going to be allured, there has to be a comfort, there has to be a lessening of the grief or the horrible teachings that put them in that circumstance.
So you go back to Ron Grimes' original question, which is what needs doing in this situation at this time and in this moment.
Yeah.
And sometimes um, the, I asked that question for a woman who had lost a child at 8 years old, and she said, "Here's what you have to do. You have to make it possible for me to wake up the morning after the funeral."
Oh,
Um, that's the challenge of this ritual. And it was like, okay, I'm you know, this is so that changed everything. It changed absolutely everything, because what we were going for was, this is horrible, this is terrible, but we need to comfort people here. I went into the planning of that funeral thinking we have to provide as much comfort as we possibly can. And I realized that the one thing that nobody was touching was that mother's fierce, fierce anger.
mm,
And it wasn't about what was going to happen 3 months from now when she might need the comfort. It was, how do I tell her it's okay to be angry? And I called a friend of mine who I trust, and said, just give me, some feedback on this. And we ended up using um, that anger in the funeral. The funeral was, I said, I don't care about anybody else at the funeral except that mother. She was a single mother, so there wasn't a father involved. I That mother is the only one I care about in the funeral. That's my job, is to make it possible for her to get up in the morning. And my opening line um, was a question, and it was, is God a cosmic son of a bitch? Today, I think the answer is yes. And and I had to work my way not to God is a lovely person who is going to comfort you eventually, but whatever God is big enough to listen to the anger, because you have every right to be angry at this point in life. And we we did things in that funeral. It was a small funeral, and we did things in that funeral that some people objected to. But that mother got up the next morning and the next morning and the next morning, and 3 months later we had a celebration of that child's life at the mother's request. And that was the time for the comfort. That was the time for all of that. But if whatever we think of as the mystery isn't big enough to take all of what we are as humans, which is sometimes anger, frustration, and yes, even violence, right? It's like, think of it when you're watching the coverage from the Ukraine. Um, Everything in my head wants to be a pacifist. Everything I believe pushes me to be a pacifist. But I can't watch some of that coverage and not want to smack somebody, not want to, just take people by the throat and say, why are you doing this? Now I can focus all that anger if I want to on Putin, but that's far too convenient. I mean, what made it possible for Putin to do this? What contributed to that? All of that stuff. But I can't deny my own violent urges, right? I can't say I'm not a violent person. Yeah, I'm violent. I'm a human. I have this urge to violence. And I think that if whatever we think of as the mystery isn't also large enough to contain that, then, there used to be a line, your God is too small. Well, your mystery is way too small if it can't contain all of what it means to be human. The good news, I think, is that there's more than just being human. The cosmos is this. The cosmos is beyond our imagination. Who knows what's out there? It's what is it? Mysterium tremendum et fascinam. Mysterious, tremendous, and fascinating all at once. It's amazing. Well, this has been, I see that we've gone over. I thank you for this. I do love your smiling faces, and your questions really are nectar, absolute nectar. It's divine. Thank you so much. I'm not going to say too much about it just yet because we're still talking about it. We The commitment was to take this through to the end of May in terms of Faith Chat. And I've had requests from some chatters who regularly check in with us that we have some conversation about life beyond May. What will that look like? And so I'm a little reluctant to do that because I feel like the wrong person to be doing that. And there's some limitations about what I can and can't say. So Andrew and I are having some conversations about how we might facilitate that, and I'm gonna set that up for the first Tuesday in June, and we'll let people know that we're going to talk about what the possibilities are going forward. I'm just talking about Faith Chat now, what that might look like in the future. By then you'll have heard at our annual meeting what the plans are for the summer in terms of online offerings. That's hopefully going to continue through September, and then where we go from where Holy Cross goes from there. And so we'll have some conversation about that on the first Tuesday in June. Okay. Well, thank you for this. Peace, dear ones.